David and Judy, you are two of America's greatest interviewers, so my main job here is not to mess it up. But I want to begin with the obvious question. To you, David, you think it's important for Americans to learn about American history. What are some of the big ideas from the Declaration and the Constitution that you want Americans to learn about?
Well, the reason I think it's important is this. Jefferson said many times that a representative democracy only works if you have an informed citizenry. Sadly, we don't have as informed a citizenry as we would like, in part because we don't teach civics and American history very much anymore. So as an example of this, are there any naturalized citizens in this room? Anybody a naturalized citizen? Okay. A naturalized citizen has to now be in this country for 5 years, and then you take a citizenship test, 100 potential questions, you're asked 10, you have to get 6 correct. If you're 65 or older, they tell you which 10 they're going to give you. The questions are things like how many branches in the federal government are there and so forth. Well, 91% of the people who try to become citizens in this country pass that test, 91%. We have 50 million immigrants in this country, not all are citizens, but of those who've tried to become citizens, 91% pass that test. The same test essentially was given to native-born Americans in all 50 states about 2 years ago, and in only one state, Vermont, could the native-born Americans pass the basic citizenship test. That suggests to you and to me that we don't really know much about history and civics. So if we don't know much about it, what's the problem? Well, as Jefferson said, if you don't have an informed citizenry, you're not likely to hold on to your democracy very long. And it wasn't far from here that Benjamin Franklin uttered his famous words when he left the Constitutional Convention, was approached by a woman, and he said, "What have you done for us, Dr. Franklin?" And he said, "I've given you a republic if you can keep it." But up until recently, people have thought, well, that was a quaint way of expressing what we got, a republic. And there was no thought that anybody would say we would lose it. But increasingly, I've begun to think that if we don't have informed citizens, we aren't going to have the republic that the Founding Fathers gave us, and we're going to have a different form of government, one that all of us probably wouldn't like as much. So what I've been trying to do in my efforts is modestly to kind of let people know more about history, more about our country's background, more about how the government works, on the theory that an informed citizenry will make the country a better country.
Judy, in your conversations across America, do you have a sense that citizens still know about and care about the American idea as expressed in the Declaration and the Constitution or not?
Well, before I answer your question, Jeffrey, I have to say what an incredibly exciting moment this is to be sitting here in this place, to be receiving this honor, and to be sitting next to my longtime friend, David Rubenstein. I have to just say, a point of personal privilege, David and I have known each other a long time. We both are baby boomers. We both went to Duke University. We both came to Washington with President Jimmy Carter, so we have a lot in common, but there are some differences when it comes to resources. You know about the Aaron brothers, Henry and his brother Tommy. They together 768 all-time record number of home runs. Henry had 755. Tommy had 13. He's Henry. So no, it is such a privilege to be here. But you asked me about whether people know what it is that we're trying to preserve, and I would say, you know, in the spirit of what David just said, yes, in many cases they do, but clearly in too many places they don't. I've crossed the country. I've now visited 12 states just over the course of the last 7 or 8 months. We've been to rural areas, we've been to cities, and we've talked to Americans across the spectrum. And you find that some people are worried, desperately worried about the state of our democracy. They worry about how their children are going to grow up in a country. They worry about whether we're turning into an authoritarian place. And there are others who, frankly, I think unfortunately take our democracy for granted, who don't think about the foundation, who don't think about some of these foundational principles. And so for me, it's been an eye-opening experience to go out and talk to them about what matters to them and what do they think divides them from other people. And that has produced, frankly, some of the most eye-opening reporting. we've seen.
I am eager to ask you about what you're learning about the causes of polarization. And I want to ask David, on that score, you say the point of studying history is so policymakers can avoid the errors of the past. And the biggest error of the past the founders were afraid of was demagogues and mobs. And they thought the whole experiment might fail when people were moved by passion rather than reason. And they had in mind Shays' Rebellion, where the debtors in Massachusetts are going after the creditors. And they designed the whole system to slow down deliberation, to stop people from making snap judgments, and stop them from retreating into armed camps. And now, of course, we're living in Madison's nightmare with a world of social media and greater polarization than at any time since the Civil War. Were the founders correct that too much democracy might lead to the fall of the republic?
Of course, the founders were brilliant in many ways, but they gave us a constitution that has 27 amendments, so not perfect. And as we know, the system, even with 27 amendments, doesn't work perfectly. They were not gigantic believers in democracy, to be honest. They were privileged people. They were all reasonably wealthy people. And they were worried about mob rule, and they were worried about true democracy, which really hadn't existed anywhere. So we have democracy under the Constitution pretty much only in the House, the way the Constitution was drafted. The Senate was to be elected by state legislatures, and the president was to be elected by the Electoral College. So it wasn't as if they said, please, people vote, and whoever wins the highest number of votes will win the office involved. I think that the other thing that I often worry about in the Constitution, and think about it, is that we had a Constitution that was developed by 50-some white privileged men. It wasn't really representative of that country and isn't representative of this country. That it survived this long with 27 amendments shows that it had some really great features in it, and it's a document, a constitution that other countries around the world really emulate and really model much of their government after. I think we have a reasonable facsimile of a representative democracy, but I worry increasingly that some of the forces in the country are not as happy with the representative democracy and are trying to take things in their own hands. One example is the one that's obvious to everybody. In the Revolutionary War, there was a flag called the Gadsden flag, developed by a man named Christopher Gadsden, a slave owner from South Carolina. And it said, "Don't tread on me." And this was a takeoff on something that Benjamin Franklin had earlier kind of put in one of his newspapers. It had a snake, and basically it was a rattlesnake. And rattlesnakes are native to the United States and not to England. And the rattlesnake was designed to say to the British, "Don't tread on me, or a rattlesnake will come and bite your head off." That same Gadsden flag was used in the events of January 6th. If you go back and look at the films on January the 6th, the irony is that the same flag used to throw off the yoke of British tyranny on us is now used by people in our country to say we want to get rid of the tyranny of the federal government or the things the federal government's doing. And so I do worry that many people in this country are thinking the country is not working the way they want it to work, and they're prepared to take things in their own hands. And I do wonder whether if we were here 100 years from today, the Constitution would still be operating the way we want it to if we continue down a certain path. I do worry about that. But hopefully it will be reasonably close to what we have today 100 years from today, but who knows?
Wow, that's an amazing detail about the "Don't Tread on Me" flag at January 6th. On that score, I just the other day came across Jefferson's greatest fear about the Constitution, which he sent to Madison when he got it a month after it was ratified. And he said, "I'm worried about a minority demagogue who might lose a presidential election, cry false votes, refuse to leave office, and seeking the supports of the states that had voted for him, install himself for life."
I can't imagine that would ever happen.
Could never happen in America, but history always speaks for itself. Judy, what are your conversations with Americans about the causes of polarization tell you about whether this is more like the Civil War than we've ever been at any point in our history?
Well, as you probably know, there are people who are comparing this period to the period immediately before the Civil War. In fact, I had the privilege of interviewing one of the members of your board, Judge Michael Ludig, and it was one of the points that he made, that his fear is that this is a period very much like what we experienced in the 1850s. What I'm seeing is a combination of things. I mean, there are forces at play in this country which we're all familiar with. Economic inequality is one of them. There are parts of this country that are not experiencing the great growth and the great wealth that other parts of the country are. I just spent a few days this week in Steubenville, Ohio, a place that used to be a thriving center of the steel industry back in the early part of the 1900s. And well, almost up until the 1970s. And then things started to change. Steel and other industries moved overseas. Jobs started to go away. That community has lost population, and it's lost hope in many ways. There are some bright spots, and I can talk about those as well. But it's a reminder when you're in a place like that where there are a few relic buildings of what was there 50 years ago, but then there are many vacant lots there, and the jobs are just not what they were. It is not the same place. They're trying to bring it to life again. But America we're divided that way. We're divided economically. We're divided over the question of race. There's no question the great problem, dilemma that America was trying to solve with the Civil War, or trying to settle with the Civil War over slavery. Yes, it was resolved in the short run, but we haven't resolved it over all these years. We are still very much a country where race is at the center of so many of our conversations. And you add to that, Jeff, the news media, the fact that we have social media, the fact that people get their news and information from so many different places. There is no more Walter Cronkite. And you can pick and choose where you want to get information. That does not lend itself to people coming together to work together on finding solutions. It certainly doesn't. It isn't happening in the Congress. We've witnessed that in recent weeks, months, and years. They're getting their news and information from completely different sources. So we have a lot of work to do. I mean, there are efforts to address it all, but right now we are at a very difficult moment. I'm stating the obvious in this country, and it requires, I think, the attention of everyone in this country who can possibly think about it as we think about what do we do. It's what you're doing here at the Constitution Center. You've spoken about that, but it's on the shoulders of everyone in this room to think about how can we as Americans, every one of us can make a difference. And I'm seeing that as I travel around the country.
Well, David, let's think about possible solutions. Madison put all his faith in a news media that would refine and cool public opinion. He imagined the literati, like journalists for The Atlantic, publishing the Federalist Papers and that slowly diffusing reason across the land. And obviously, as Judy just said, a world of social media and enraged to engage and identity politics seems like the opposite of that. What can be done to resurrect that Madisonian deliberation through public education?
Well, if I knew, I'd be in Iowa and New Hampshire, but there's no easy way to do it. Of course, I'm probably too young to run for president. I'm only 74, and you need to be a lot older. So I'm going to wait a few years. But the media has changed dramatically from the days of Madison. In those days, a very small percentage of Americans actually were literate. And in those days, a very small percentage of Americans were allowed to participate in government. In 1776, for example, we only had 3 million people in the country. 3 million people. And of those 3 million, 500,000 were slaves in 1776, so they couldn't be in government. And then you had 1.25 million remaining white women, and they weren't allowed to be in government. And then you had 10,000 Jews, and they couldn't be in government. And then you had about 500,000 Christian non-property owning men, and they couldn't be in government. So you had about 500,000 Christian property owning men. And those people were reasonably literate and pretty well educated, as the founding fathers indicate. It is amazing that out of those 500,000 people, white Christian property-owning men, we got George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, Benjamin Franklin. Today, we have 350 million people, and we have something less than that. So where did all the great people go? Well, it's easy to say they went into private equity, but I don't think that's fair. I think it's a sad situation that the most talented people in the country today often don't want to serve in government because the media is so vicious, the need to raise money is such a relentless effort, and the vitriol is so bad that people just don't want to put up with it. Now, the vitriol was bad in the early days, too, we know that, and it was worse in the Civil War. But I just think that we are now heading down a slippery slope where it's seen as nothing wrong with vilifying people for senseless reasons only to raise money for your cause. And sadly, in the House of Representatives now, most of the members are spending about 40 or 50% of their time raising money. And they raise money not by saying to people, I want to do something right down the center that's good for the country. That's not how you raise money. You appeal to the far left and the far right, and the result is the division is so great that I don't know where we're going to easily better bridge it to get back to the case where people can actually talk to each other from different sides. And it's not as bad as the Civil War yet. In the Civil War, the year before the Civil War, we had roughly 60 fights on the floor of the Congress where people were physically hitting each other. Now, we haven't come to that stage yet, but people are doing the same thing with verbs and words, and I really worry about the future of the country's ability to operate in a very bipartisan way, in a way that's likely to have the kind of principles that we have in our Constitution and Declaration of Independence honored in any meaningful way.
And Jeff, you know, partisan primaries are a big part of what David is talking about. Partisan primaries have helped to drive people in the Republican Party who are running for office to the right and people running for office in the Democratic Party to the left, farther apart, harder to come together, harder to find compromise.
That's such a central and constructive solution, and scholars on both sides have suggested that ranked choice voting, which would end the need to pander to the extremes in the primaries, would be the greatest thing we could do to get moderate candidates. In our final moments, before we award you the Liberty Medal, Judy, your interviews have been so illuminating. You have identified a range of possible solutions. Sidney Milkus, the UVA presidential historian, said rebuilding trust in institutions, including the primaries themselves and their ability to choose candidates outside the primary system, is one. You've interviewed local journalists. Tell us about a few of the most constructive solutions that you've encountered.
Some of the most constructive things that I hear or I see going on out there come from these so-called bridging groups. I'm sure you've heard of many of them. They're called Braver Angels, Common Ground. There's one, Listen Up, efforts at the national and the community level to get people to come together, to do something as simple as sit across the table from each other, have a cup of coffee or maybe a beer, just to talk to each other. And they're exploring ways. Do you start with the most contentious issues? Do you start with immigration and abortion? Or do you start by having a conversation like, well, where'd you grow up? You know, where do you like to take vacations? Tell me about your family. The kinds of things that you would have a conversation with someone you're just meeting for the first time. But there are all these experiments going on. We visited the polarization lab at Stanford University, where they are literally looking at their graduate students are coming up with ideas for how to get people to listen to each other, people who have diametrically opposed political views. And some of it is that straightforward. It's, okay, do you start with the contentious politics, or do you start with the things you might have in common? But these groups are working. It's one person at a time, but it is making, I think, it will make a difference. It's going to take time. There are a lot of people in this country who don't like where we are, and they're trying to do something about it. And the other thing I would say is that there are parts of the country where my good friends, and many of you know who they are, Jim and Deb Fallows, who traveled around in his little Cessna to different communities across America. They did this a few years ago, even before some of the most current divisions have arisen. And they've identified communities where people are working across partisan division. And in many instances, in fact, I think in every instance, it's a result of kind of inspired local leadership, people who are willing to overlook the opinions of people on the other side and say, we need to come together to think about the future of this community and not be so focused on whether you're an R and I'm a D and whether you think this and I think that on an issue. So that is happening. It's not happening in enough places, but the fact that it's happening at all, I think, is something we have to be inspired by.
Let me just comment, if I could, on the division in the country. When John Kennedy ran for president, he campaigned in roughly 40 states. Richard Nixon famously campaigned in all 50 states, probably a mistake to do so. But why did they do that? Why did they campaign in all those states? They did because they didn't know how these states were necessarily going to vote. Today, there's no need to do that. We know how 40 states are going to vote for certain. 40 states have voted exactly the same the last 4 presidential elections. 40 states have voted either red or blue. There's only 10 states left. And the election is down to those 10 states, and that's how the presidential election campaigns are. But it really shows that we've become almost a red country and a blue country. If you go to Texas and talk to people about some of the things that people in New York are interested in or feel is the right thing, people will laugh at you. And if you are in New York and you try to talk to people about certain things, people in Texas would laugh at certain things that people in Texas or New York think is appropriate. In other words, the country is getting so divided that we really are almost a red country and a blue country with about 10 states maybe balancing in between. And I think that's unfortunate, and I don't think it's getting better anytime soon. I host a dinner once a month for members of Congress. And it's a free dinner, so they come. And, and it's held at the Library of Congress, a neutral site. And I usually interview a historian or somebody like that. And I do it thinking that who should know more about our history than people making the laws? Seems obvious. And the members of Congress say, well, they like the interviews and so forth, but they say that this is the only time in Washington that they can be with somebody from the opposite party and the opposite house without fear that they're going to be criticized for fraternizing with the enemy. And there are no press there. And it's a sad situation. They don't really have, there used to be things called conference committees where the House and the Senate would come together and figure out how to fix legislation. There's no legislation anymore, and if there is, it's all done in the leadership, so there's no conference committees, so they don't get to know each other from the one house from the other, and there's hardly any congressional delegations going abroad anymore because they get criticized for that. So their members don't know each other, and most of the members are only there 3 days a week as well. So it's a sad situation. The members of Congress don't know each other, they don't like each other, and if you're in a different party, they don't talk to you. And this is not a prescription for a successful democracy going forward.
Judy, your suggestion of inspired local leadership and David's suggestion of a space where members of both parties can set aside their tribal labels and actually talk to each other is so constructive. Judy, you should have the last word. Are you optimistic or pessimistic about the future of democracy?
Well, as you travel the country and you see the divisions over everything from book banning to what to teach in schools to certainly over immigration, the list goes on, it's easy to fall into pessimism, but I am at heart an optimist. I hope a realistic one, and I have to have faith in the American people. I have to believe that the American people are not going to let this continue. It may be another generation before we see the kind of improvement that we all know we've got to have if we're going to solve our toughest problems. But this remains the most remarkable country on the planet. Yes, there are many important parts of the world, but the United States is this extraordinary experiment. And I have to believe that the American people are not going to let us go down a dark, dark path. And so I put my faith in them, and I have to believe it's going to be better.
Oh, beautiful.